Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Real Influencers Project. I'm your host, Craig Reynolds, and with me today is Dr. Joseph Moore, although I like to call him Joe Moore because I've known him for quite some time. Joe, thank you so much for stopping in today. How's everything going?
We're doing great. We're staying, what is it, safe and well? Isn't that everybody's greeting right now? Stay safe and well. It's the COVID liturgy. You know, the Lord be with you and also with you. Be safe, be well. So we're safe and well, and I hope you guys are.
Absolutely. I can't complain. Well, Joe, I came up with this idea because I've seen when people think of influencers today, they think of social media and they see the people that are selling and supporting and doing the things they do on social media. And right now, it's a great way to make a living considering we have to be distanced. But for me, when I think of influencer, I think of my friends and my family, my neighbors, the people that I've actually had contact with and not through a screen. And I feel like this is a time that we need to look into those people and how do they help us get to where we are today? And you've got a killer backstory. I mean, what you do now, you're a doctor.
Living it was slightly less exciting than telling it, but yes.
Right. Well, I think that's part of the beauty of it all. You're an author, and you've just recently started another podcast, which we'll get to in a minute, which sounds fascinating. And I'll be the first to admit, I was never really good in school. Well, let me rephrase that. I never really paid a lot of attention in school.
Good. You're my target audience. Like
yes.
the people who paid lots of attention, they have all the degrees and they read the big books. Like, no, that's the whole audience of the project is people who are like, this is interesting, but I never paid attention in school. So yeah, it'll be perfect.
Well, then before we get to, I know that the saying is you don't know where you're going unless you know where you came from. I also think if you know where someone came from, you know a lot about them right away. So where did you grow up?
I grew up in the Carolinas, from the South, I think my family moved to the Carolinas in 1760 something. If I used to think it was 1772 and then found out it was about 15 years earlier. But so we've been in the Carolinas a long time. Like if there's a town in South Carolina that I don't know, you lose, I'll pay you $10. Like I've been all across the Carolinas. But and then from growing up in the Carolinas, did undergrad there and then went off after that and kind of bummed around the world for a while. So
nice. That sounds excellent. Well, obviously you sound well-rounded and well-traveled. Was there ever a time when you were younger that there was a trigger that said, I want to be a professor, I want to be a teacher? Like,
well, I think that's the thing is like I was this kid in the Carolinas. So, rural South Carolina has its own excitements, but only the same things over and over. And I read a lot. I was from a reading family, and I read histories and I read kind of epics and these kinds of things. And it gave me this wanderlust that like, I got to get out of this place, and then you get out of this place and you realize everyone where you go is sitting here going, if I could only go to the United States to someplace called the Carolinas, then life would have meaning. Like everybody's sitting there wanting to get out of where they are and go to where you were. But I finally, as I got old enough to kind of make my own way, it was like, I'm getting out of here. And so I bummed around through the university systems. I was at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, where I did some graduate work, and then at Notre Dame, where I was a visiting scholar, and then at Queen's University Belfast, where I was a visiting scholar in Northern Ireland, and then did a lot of kind of bumming around Europe from home base being there. And then came, of course, back home to the Carolinas as a professor. So it was one of those things I used my love of reading as a springboard to, well, how can I get out of here? Well, I'm really good at reading. So I bet I can get to a graduate program. And if you get to a graduate program, there's all these fellowships and travel stipends. And so like Harvard gave me money to go to Scotland. I was like, well, that's cool because I have no money, but I'll go and live, really cheaply in Scotland for a while and do research. And so I kind of found that I could get into that lane and I could learn a lot. I could meet a lot of really interesting people, but mostly I could use it as a vehicle to get the heck out of here. And so that kind of sense of like, I'm in this small corner of the world, but I'm most interested in all the others, which of course, by the time you come back home, makes the world you grew up in more interesting, I think. But that's a circuitous way of saying I went to graduate school. I used a lot of travel fellowships to expand my horizons and then ended up as a professor, history professor.
And what I'm hearing, which we'll get to that in a second as well, your influence was growth. Like you wanted to expand and be bigger and better than you felt that you were.
Yeah, my influence to do that though was extremely pedestrian in that it was like Louis L'Amour novels or something like, it was Louis L'Amour, who's this famous Western author who nobody reads today and nobody really probably should because it's very much locked in the time that it was written. But he wrote these very simplistic but nonetheless compelling, old Western stories. But he wrote one about medieval Europe, and it was 600 pages or something. It was, and I was like 10 years old, 11 years old, like fascinated by this, just reading and reading, just imagining. And this is what reading does. You get to imagine another world. Sure. You imagine that it exists, and you imagine that someone has to go there and be there. So I guess I could go there and be there. And so what really inspired me was just, again, nothing dramatically intellectual, just the reading novels about other places. Reading novels about the American Revolution and starting in Britain, and like, oh, I could go to this place called England, right? Or I could go to France. And so I think it was just fiction, honestly, that got me as inspired as anything. No one person in particular early on, except my grandfather. Now, my grandfather was he was a brilliant man. Fought in World War II, fought in the Pacific, and I would sit at his feet for endless hours and just listen to stories. Because he wouldn't tell stories of the war when he was in his 50s and 60s. But by the time he got to his 70s, he kind of loosened up a bit and he would tell you the funny things, right? And every now and again, he'd slip and tell you the not funny things. And I mean, I ate every word of that man's hand, and I learned to tell stories from him. So I think the combination of idolizing my grandfather who had traveled the world, although it turns out he really hated traveling the world because he was getting shot at most of the time.
Can't blame him.
Right. And then he just wanted to come home. And reading fiction, it made me want to travel. It made me want to be somewhere else and believe that I could get there. So that's from my earliest. And
then from there, I mean, obviously you become a professor,
yep.
Which you just mentioned, but you also wrote a book as well.
I did. So apparently it turns out when they give you money to travel all over the world in academia, they expect you to do something with it. And so I was like, well, I should probably take this dissertation thing and turn it into a book. So I wrote a book on a group of radical, I stumbled into the project. My doctoral mentor, who was a tremendous influence on me, had been in the archives at Duke University one day, and he stumbled into a group of papers of Southern preachers preaching against slavery in like the 1840s. Well, that's not supposed to be, right?
Yeah, right.
And he thought, well, surely this is shocking. This should change everything. But he couldn't figure out who they were and why they existed. And it was just about to propose from Notre Dame and UNC Greensboro and some other institution, I don't remember. 3 of them were going to pick one doctoral student who would be funded to figure this thing out. And as he's working on that, my letter of application comes in, and he reads it very closely. And like, here's a guy who understands the Carolinas. I came from a Presbyterian background, so he's like, I bet this kid could do it. And he just trashed the whole idea. It's like, I'm going to give this to you. So he said, when I got to the university, I wanted to do a dissertation on the American Revolution, on loyalists, the British side of the American Revolution. And my first meeting with my doctoral advisor, he says, yeah, you're not going to do the loyalist. Nobody does the loyalist anymore. Like, I just moved to North Carolina for this. You're kind of ruining my plans. And he said, no, I want you to go to Duke. I want you to find this file. I want you to pull it out and then come back and talk to me. Didn't tell me anything else. So I drive out to Durham. I pull the file dutifully. I read through, it's maybe this thick of just old sermons against slavery in South Carolina in the 1840s. I'm like, this doesn't make any sense. So I drive back to him. Who are these people? He said, exactly, there's your dissertation.
Wow.
And so for the next 10 years of my intellectual life, I tried to pull that thread. Like, where did these people come from? And it came to find out they were extremely radical Scotch-Irish immigrants who actually had been extremely radical before the issue of slavery was an issue. And so they were radical about everything. They had this kind of hypersensitivity to all issues of church and state. They wouldn't fit anything we call today right wing or left wing because they were on a different spectrum. And I wrote that history of these kind of, who were the weird, crazy radicals in the South preaching against slavery. There's not many, but this group existed. And so that became a book called Founding Sins, which came out, I want to say, in 2015. And And that dominated my intellectual life for the better part of a decade. Once that was done, I kind of looked around and I was trying to I should do the next academic book, right? Because academics don't get paid a lot. I think maybe that's not very well known, but there's not a lot of money in academia. Maybe it's very niche markets, but we get paid in prestige, right? And we peddle in prestige. And so what every academic is really after is tenure and awards, because that's what makes them feel like, in a room full of super nerds, how do you stand out?
Right.
And the way you stand out is that all the other super nerds either gave you a permanent job or gave you an award that said you were the best of the super nerds on that topic that year. And so it really is what drives us. And what I found after my first book came out, and it was well received and it did well and I got tenure and all that, was that I actually don't like prestige. It doesn't resonate with me. I was doing this book because it was intellectually interesting. I was curious. I had gotten lucky enough to stumble onto a problem that didn't have an obvious solution. If this was a math equation, other mathematicians would have scratched their chin and said, I don't get it either. And somebody had to figure it out, and I was going to figure it out. I was more interested in the influence, or in the idea. And I guess the downside of that would be the power, but I want the power of this idea to be out there and to influence a conversation. I wasn't really after the money, because there was none, but I wasn't really after the prestige either. I was just into the question and the answer, all right, and affecting the conversation about those issues. So what I found about myself was, when I went to go write the next book, I got all this advice from other academics, and all the advice was things that would give me more academic prestige, and I didn't really care about those things. And I actually spent 6 months trying to write the next academic book, and I hated my life. I hated it because I wasn't curious about it. So I guess that's kind of the first set of influences. And then the next influence was, then I went from there to, I've always had an interesting, not interesting, I've always been interested in finance, money. And I got that from an accidental experience at the Great Recession, which was that my wife and I had bought a home. We were like every other, I'm in a PhD program. We're like every other stupid American. We've gotten a no income. We have graduate stipends. That's enough for beer money and rent. And someone gave us a mortgage, right? And we didn't have the presence of mind to think, this is a system that can't work. So we get a mortgage on a townhouse. We're making the payments. Everything's fine. We're both working side jobs. And our church has a financial literacy class. And the guy who's really passionate about it is a friend of mine. And he's a nice guy. He's a great father. I really admire him as a dad. And I'm like, yeah, dude, this guy seems to know what he's talking about, and I want to help support his desire to have people show up. So we'll show up to support Jim. Well, we show up to support Jim, and the first thing they make us do is a budget, and we look at each other like, we have no business owning a house. This is ridiculous. What are we thinking? And the worst part of it was the Starbucks line item. When I actually had to quantify how much money went to Starbucks, I could have bought a truck. And so hundreds
of dollars in coffee.
Absolutely. It was terrible. And so and that's become quite a cliche, by the way, in the financial investment industry, or the financial advice industry. It's if for the price of a cup of Starbucks a day, well, most people actually aren't spending $5 a day on coffee, because that's ridiculous. We were.
Absolutely.
All right. So we put the house on the market. It's 2008, I want to say 2007, 2008. And the market nationwide had peaked, but it had not peaked in the South yet, really. And certainly not in the space we were in. And so we put our house on the market. People get in a bidding war. We're in a contract a week later for more than we asked for. Our neighbor decides she also wants to sell. She puts her house on the market a week after we do. Never sells it. So we're the last people off the Titanic in 2008. And I had sold some other assets that I just happened to have, because I was trying to read, but I wasn't brilliant. I was just trying to, actually I shouldn't be exposed to all these things, because I should do some basic level stuff, right? Mm-hmm. And I do all that at just the perfect moment. And it was luck. that left me endlessly curious about money. It's like, I thought I was so smart and I just got lucky. All right, so what does that mean? And so I was always interested. This was like my side hobby. And so when I got done with the book, I was like, I want to do something else, but I don't know what. And I read a book by, and this is almost embarrassing to say as an active, I read a book by Tim Ferriss called The 4-Hour Workweek. And I have all kinds of problems with that book, but the core idea is brilliant in that here's a guy who starts this business. It takes over his life. He's making good money, but he has no life. And he decides to basically fire 80% of his customers because he hates his life. Right. And he decides, how can I make my business work in a kind of an automated way? And then he gets into all these interesting kind of side notes about, well, why do I live where I live? Why don't I live in South America? It's much cheaper, right? And I can do a lot of this remotely. Why do I have this? Why do I have that? And I started going through that process of, well, why am I doing what I'm doing? And that helped me realize I really don't care about prestige. Like, I don't need an academic award. I don't need to win a Guggenheim Fellowship to feel like my ideas are worth hearing. So,
when I hear you say that, it's something that I've said for years. It's something that I don't always do, sadly, but I've always said, do what you love. Do what you love, and the money will follow. Slowly, I'm getting back into that, obviously, but that is something that's very near and dear to me, and that's what I keep hearing you say as well.
Yeah, it was like, well, it was a version of pursue your passion. But I think with every time you pursue your passion, hopefully you get a little bit smarter about it. I think the most dangerous person pursuing their passion never pursued their passion. Now they're 45 and they're just going to leave it all because, and like, actually all the different attempts to pursue my passion taught me a lot of lessons. Like, it's hard. Nothing's ever as quick as you want it to be. You're probably going to eat beans and rice a few years of this, like, to make it work. Right.
Yeah. Ramen noodles.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a learning curve to pursuing what you want to do.
Yes.
And I'm peripatetic in that sense. Like, I'm constantly like moving from place to place and thing to thing. Like, once I close the loop on a thing, I'm going to move to the next thing and start a new loop and close that loop. Mm-hmm. And that process, you do pick up the idea of like, well, to start this venture, it's going to feel like this. I'm going to have these highs, I'm going to have these lows, and I don't know what the challenges will be, but they will be very real and they will be very stressful. And then I'll know what it feels like every time I'm overcoming them. And then when I get to the end, I'll know what that feels like too.
Right.
So
are you feeling the same way now that you've started this podcast that we're getting to?
Absolutely.
As you did with the book.
Absolutely. Well, there was a step in between the two. So I got fascinated with personal finance.
Yep.
And so as a corollary to that, I read a bunch of personal finance and investing books, and I have my own opinions on those things, and I'm not a financial advisor and I don't play one on the internet. But I decided that, like, the thing that I could do on the side of being a professor was, because the recession had obviously cut the prices of housing so drastically. It was like, I could buy rental properties. I didn't want to flip houses. I didn't want to do none of that TV stuff, but like, I could buy decent properties, make them nice, and rent them out. And that was, so I started doing this on a lark. And I finally went to go buy my first true, I kind of stumbled into something before, but like my first true investment property. And my wife had told me, all right, I know you're going to buy one. You're going to look at several. You can buy one. I came back and I bought 5. She was like, I said you could buy one. And I was like, well, that was a good deal, And that started this journey. So instead of writing my next book and getting really, excited about that, I just started buying rental properties as my hobby. So I'd work my whole day, and then I get to the end of the workday and I'd do the research on properties, or I'd do the emailing with the contractors or whatever. Before I knew it, I've all told had just above or below 30 properties at one time or another. I learned a lot. I made a lot of mistakes. But I hate to give credit to this book for inspiring that, but what inspired me to think about that was the book Rich Dad, Poor Dad, which I have so many intellectual problems with, and I feel like messes up a lot of people. But it's one of those books that, like, 95% of the pages are absolute BS, but it's the 5% that are jewels that is worth them, and you have to dig through the manure to get them, but they're there.
Right.
And it's life-changing in the sense that, like, okay, I have to reconceive of how I live a financial life. And so I did that while being a professor who was now bored and didn't want the intellectual project of a prestige book. So I just went off and bought rental properties. Well,
that's what they do.
Yeah. So then I started to wind that down because the market got very, very hot. And I just felt like, okay, I've seen this before. And secondly, I wanted to free up some money to do something else with my life. And that was, do I really want to be a professor in North Carolina? My wife took a job in Georgia. My daughters are Georgia. Like, I think I really want to be home. And there I got inspired just with this idea of, all right, what I'm really after is sharing my ideas. And if you can wrap your mind around that, then suddenly leaving a job is not very scary, right? Like I had a prestige job that was paid fine. It was a good job. I enjoyed it. I had great colleagues, but that's not what I was in pursuit of anymore. And so that loop's closed. Let's go to the next loop. The next loop is, well, how do I get my ideas out there? And obviously podcasting has become a crowded space, but it's maybe the most interesting way I've ever seen an idea sharing platform transition. Because 20 years ago, nobody listened to their books unless you were on like CDs. And that was, the percentage of people who listen to books on CDs was, microscopic. Some people still listen to books now, like in their car, but what people are really listening to is podcasts.
Yep.
Right. Because it's self-contained. It's basically every podcast is a chapter of a book. And so every time somebody turns on the Influencers Project, it's like they get a chapter on influence and inspiration. And they can be done with it, and the most important part of learning is what you do after you stop reading or listening. That's when the brain actually learns, it's not while you're listening, it's after. Yes. So it's a famous example of this where if you're trying to pick furniture, and I'm stealing this, by the way, this idea does not belong to me, right? If you're trying to pick furniture for your house, that's such a shockingly problematic equation to solve, because you're solving for space, color, culture, all at the same time, right? What will fit in the space? What is my taste? What is my spouse's taste? What is the taste right now on trend? What color works with the other things that fit my taste in space that are already in the space? It's hard to pick a couch. And so they say the psychologists have studied this, and the best thing you can do is go walk the stores, like look at the options, and then go home and forget about it. And you will just wake up one morning and you'll know what's the right couch, because your brain in the background will process the information. Right. And it will select and deselect until it's like that thing fits with that issue. And then same with podcasts. People listen, they turn it off, their brain keeps working on what they heard. And I think if you really want to be part of the conversation, this is a great space to be in. So that's what led me to leave academia and my cushy tenure job, where I could work 22 hours a week and get paid a full-time salary. And I was like, oh, I know it's a smart idea. I'll leave all this behind.
Yeah, and why not? Exactly.
Yeah.
So your wife told me that you were working on this project a while ago, and I thought it was fascinating. And I thought it was going to be a book, but then maybe she said it was going to be a podcast all along. But what's it called? Dead People's Money?
So it's Dead People's Money.
So good, dude.
Deadpeoplesmoney.com. And the title says exactly what I'm after. Like, what did dead people do with their money? And yeah, sir, famous people, but also like, what did everyday people do? Right. How did everyday people invest in land, or like, how did they build their wealth or lose their wealth? I mean, I'm just as fascinated with people who go broke as who make it big. So what is it like to go broke in the 1830s? And is there anything to learn from that today? Because academic history is long on like policy suggestions, most of which are bad and most of which end poorly. But academic history is very short on like, so how should your life be different knowing this? And so I wanted to kind of to approach it in the sense that this will be useful for people. Right. Because everybody wants history in the sense that like it's fun. Like they skipped it in school. They didn't listen in class. They got the C so they could get the degree, and they moved on. But now they're like, oh man, I really wish I knew this stuff. But they really wish they knew it, because they realize if I knew this stuff, it'd be helpful to my actual life today. It would inform how I think about my world. So we're trying to do that with Dead People's Money. It's a podcast, it's a blog, so there's kind of essays. You could think of them as like history sermons. Like it's 15 minutes of the text is the past. How does this shape our present? and does it give us any idea about the future? And I'm actually, I'm not a big fan of the idea that like there's just some kind of schematic from history that you can draw and, like it's an equation and eventually you will solve for X and know what to do because how to stop Hitler invading France or something. Like there's no correlation to a lot of this stuff, but there's some general principles. And so how do we get at those principles? Like, how do we understand that housewives did most of the budgeting for human history? And that women were some of those savviest financial players in history and in the rise of capitalism.
Well, the fact that the thing that blows my mind is how marketers didn't market to women, knowing that they're the ones that handle the purse strings, so to speak.
Well,
right?
and when marketers turned their attention to women, the rewards were exponential. I mean,
yeah, they're in charge. Let's face it. As a man, they're in charge, no question.
Well, we've all had that experience, right? Like I get this tiny little, I get the image of authority and none of the actual authority.
Dude,
right?
Totally, absolutely.
Yeah. But no, this happens in the early 20th century in New York. There's a series of advertisements for furniture called "You Furnish the Girl," meaning like you bring us the girl, we'll furnish the house. And so it's targeting men. Like bring us your bride to be, and we'll furnish your apartment. Who's actually making the decision about furniture? It's the woman, right?
Yeah.
And so whereas the marketing in the middle of the 20th century is all targeted at women. I've got a buddy who's writing a book on the history of like as narrow as this could be, on the history of advertising Cannon Mills towels. And it, like once they realize that their real target audience is women, right? Like the sales are fascinating to watch. So anyway, I could do this forever. I won't, but this is the way we send them to your blog and to your podcast. Because if it is intriguing to people, I'd love for them to come visit. So we've only just started. It's we're early on. I'm doing a series on real estate investing that'll come out in a few weeks. But the history of real estate investments. But it's just kind of like, how did regular people do this stuff? And it's fun. It's a new challenge for me intellectually. There will be a book, but we'll figure out when that book comes out, whenever I get around to writing it.
And I bet you'll enjoy writing this one for sure.
I'm looking forward to it. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, Joe, man, listen, I don't want to take up any more of your time. I really appreciate you coming in and sharing all of your experiences and your knowledge. It's priceless. I could continue to talk with you about this and listen the whole time, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to log in and check out your blog and listen to the podcast.
Thanks, man. I appreciate it. It's good to talk to you. Good to see you, and good luck with this venture. It's an exciting one.
Well, thanks, man. I appreciate it, and it's great to see you as well. Tell the family I said hello. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in to the Real Influencers Project. If you like what you're seeing, please make sure you subscribe, and we'll see you next time.